Alright, let's talk about one of the biggest, baddest, and most stubborn war bosses to ever stomp across the galaxy, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. If you know anything about Warhammer 40k, you've probably heard his name whispered in fear, bellowed in rage, or chanted in the deafening roar of a Waaagh. He's not just another orc warlord, he's the orc warlord. A brute of terrifying cunning, a warrior blessed, or cursed, with visions straight from the orcish gods, and, if you believe the legends, something far more than just another greenskin. Because here's the thing, he should be dead, more than once in fact. And yet, he keeps coming back. Shot, crushed, burned, and even beheaded. But Ghazghkull just doesn't stay down. This has led to one of the most bizarre and fascinating debates in Warhammer 40k lore. Is Ghazghkull truly immortal? Now, when we talk about immortality in 40k, we're not just asking whether someone can live forever. There are plenty of ways to cheat death. Warp sorcery, Necron, technology, genetic modification. But Ghazghkull? He's just an orc. Or at least he's supposed to be. So how is it that every time he's struck down, he somehow finds a way to come back stronger? Is it pure luck? Some twisted miracle of orc biology? Or is there something far more supernatural at play? To answer this, we need to start at the beginning. Before the legend, before the wars, before the galaxy knew his name. Who was Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka? And how did he become the unkillable nightmare that haunts the Imperium? Ghazghkull Mag Uruk. Thraka wasn't born a legend. Like every other orc, he started as just another green-skinned brute in the endless tide of violence that is orc society. But even among his kind, Ghazghkull was something different. He wasn't just strong, he was smart. Not in the way humans or Aldari would define intelligence, but in the way that made him uniquely suited for survival in the brutal world of orcs. He had an instinct for war, a nose for leadership, and, most importantly, an absolute, unwavering belief that he was meant for something greater. And in the world of orcs, belief is everything. His early years were spent brawling, like any other boy in an orc clan. He came from the Goths, the most brutal and war-hungry of all orc tribes, which meant there was no room for weakness. You fought, you conquered, or you died. But Ghazghkull wasn't just another scrapper. He had a talent for making others follow him, even when he was just a young warrior. There was something about him, an aura of raw power that made others fall in line. Some orcs are born to fight, others to tinker with machines. But Ghazghkull? He was born to lead. His true rise began on the planet Urk, a classic orc world where war was as natural as breathing. It was there that fate, or something much bigger, intervened. During one particularly brutal battle, Ghazghkull took a bolter round straight to the head. And not just a graze. This was the kind of wound that should have left. Him, a twitching corpse on the battlefield, most orcs would have been done for. But not him. Instead of dying, he went into a near-death state, teetering on the edge of the abyss. And that's when it happened. The visions. According to legend, Ghazghkull saw Gork and Mork themselves, the twin gods of orc kind, the brutal and the cunning, the unstoppable force and the immovable object. They didn't speak in words, because orcs don't need words. They spoke in war, in the promise of endless battle, in the sheer undeniable force of Waaagh itself. And they chose him. They showed him a future where he wasn't just a war boss. He was the Warboss, the prophet of the greatest Waaagh the galaxy had ever seen. Now, here's where things get interesting. Some fans argue that this was just the brain damage talking, that getting shot in the head simply scrambled his brain enough to make him believe he had seen the orc gods. But others, especially those who really get into the deeper mysteries of 40k, suggest that this was something more. Because in Warhammer, faith is power. Orc reality is shaped by belief, and if enough orcs believe something, it becomes true. Could it be that Gork and Mork really did choose him? That their divine energy flowed through him, making him something more than just another green skin? Whatever the truth, when Ghazghkull woke up, he was changed. Not just physically, though that bolter round left him with a crude metal plate jammed into his skull, but mentally. He wasn't just an ambitious orc anymore. He had purpose. He had seen what others could never see, and he was going to make that vision a reality. From that moment on, he stopped being just another warrior and became a prophet. He spoke of the great Waaagh to come, of a galaxy that would burn under the green tide, and orcs, being orcs, listened. This was the turning point. This was when Ghazghkull went from being a tough fighter to something else entirely. He wasn't the biggest orc, nor the strongest, at least not yet. But he had something far more valuable, a vision. And in a society that thrives on strength and domination, that vision made him unstoppable. He began gathering followers, not just through sheer brutality, but through belief. He knew he was destined for greatness, and so did the orcs who followed him. And that's what really makes Ghazghkull terrifying. He isn't just a brute swinging a chopper, he's a warlord with a cause. And when orcs have a cause, the galaxy bleeds. Next, we'll talk about the moment that should have been the end of him. The first time Ghazghkull was struck down in battle. Because if you thought this story was already unbelievable, you haven't seen anything yet. If there's one thing that defines Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, it's that he doesn't stay dead. But to understand why people even ask whether he's immortal, you need to go back to what should have been his first and final death, the Battle of Urk Prime. This wasn't just another scrap between orc warbands. This was one of those defining moments where everything could have ended before his legend had even begun. And yet, somehow, he came back. By this point, Ghazghkull had already made a name for himself among the orcs. He wasn't just some upstart warboss anymore. He was the Warboss. His vision of a galaxy-wide Waaagh was spreading, and orcs from all over were rallying to him. The Imperium, of course, saw the danger. A rising orc leader with this kind of ambition? That was the kind of thing that had to be crushed before it spiraled out of control. So they sent in the Imperial Guard and Adeptus Astartes to put him down. The Battle of Urk Prime was a slaughter. Orcs don't do strategy the way humans do, but they don't need to. They overwhelm. The Imperium, for all its firepower and discipline, found itself drowning in green-skinned fury. Ghazghkull led from the front, bellowing, smashing, tearing through enemy lines with the kind of brutal efficiency only an orc can manage. And for a while, it looked like he might actually win. And then, it happened. Depending on who you ask, the exact details of Ghazghkull's death vary. Some say it was a plasma blast straight to the chest, tearing through his armor and scorching him to the bone. Others claim it was a chain fist from a Terminator, slicing through him like he was nothing. One of the more brutal accounts even describes him taking a melta-blast to the face, reducing half his skull to slag. But whatever it was, the result was the same. Ghazghkull went down, and not just wounded, not lightly singed, but still roaring. He was done. His body was broken, his warband was scattering, and for all intents and purposes, this should have been the end. There was no coming back from a wound like that. Even for an orc, there are limits to what you can survive, and Ghazghkull had hit his. Now here's where things get weird. Normally, when a warboss dies, his Waaagh collapses. Orcs are simple like that. If the biggest and meanest among them falls, the next biggest and meanest takes over, and the fight goes on. But this time, the orcs hesitated. Even as the Imperium pushed forward, even as their leader lay in a pool of his own blood, the war didn't end. Some orcs even fought harder, as if they refused to believe he was gone. And then, his body disappeared. That's the part that makes this whole thing so mysterious. The Imperium was sweeping the battlefield, burning orc corpses, making sure nothing could come back. But when they reached where Ghazghkull had fallen, he wasn't there. Just gone. No trace, no corpse, nothing. And that's when the rumors started. Some say his body was dragged away by his boys, carted off before the Imperium could finish the job. Others believe something much stranger, that the Orc's belief in his invincibility was so strong, so unshakable, that reality itself refused to let him die. That somehow, through sheer faith and the power of Waaagh, Ghazghkull had been saved. And let's be honest, this isn't even the craziest thing in Warhammer. We know that Orc technology works purely because they believe it does. We know their numbers swell beyond what's biologically possible simply because they expect more Orcs to appear. If an entire warband refused to accept that their boss was dead, is it really so impossible that the universe listened? But if you don't buy into that, then there's a much more convenient explanation. One that involves a certain mad doc and some very questionable medical procedures. Because this wasn't the last time Ghazghkull would rise from what should have been certain death. If Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka had been anyone else, his story would have ended there. Just another fallen warboss, another footnote in the endless slaughter of Warhammer 40k. But Ghazghkull wasn't just anyone, and Orcs don't follow the same rules as the rest of the galaxy. Whether it was sheer luck, divine intervention, or something else entirely, he was not dead. And the reason for that? One particularly insane, genius, and utterly unhinged Orc, Mad Doc Grotznik. Or, as he was known back then, Big Mech Mad Doc Grotznik. Now, if you know anything about Orc medicine, you know it's a terrifying concept. Orc docs don't go to medical school, they don't take anatomy classes, and they certainly don't follow anything resembling ethical guidelines. They work off of instinct, trial and error, and, most importantly, the unshakable belief that whatever they're doing will work. And somehow, it usually does. But even among Orc medics, Big Mech Mad Doc Grotznik was something else. He wasn't just a mad genius. He was the mad genius, the kind of lunatic who looked at a pile of severed limbs and thought, yeah, I can fix that. So when Ghazghkull's broken, mangled, barely recognizable body was dragged to Grotznik's workshop, most sane beings would have called it a lost cause. The warboss was done, guts hanging out, limbs shattered, head practically caved in. There was no coming back from that. But Grotznik wasn't sane, and more importantly, he was obsessed. See, Orcs don't really have traditional religion, but they do have belief. And Grotznik? He believed in Ghazghkull, whether it was because of the warboss's raw power, his visions, or just some deep-seated mech boy instinct that told him this one is special. Grotznik refused to let him die. So he got to work. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Orc surgery is already horrifying, but whatever Grotznik did to Ghazghkull was something else entirely. He cut, stitched, welded, bolted, and quite possibly just smashed bits together until something worked. He wasn't just patching up a wounded Orc, he was rebuilding him. And he didn't just fix what was broken, he upgraded. Ghazghkull's shattered skull, reinforced with a massive iron plate, turning his head into something that could probably withstand a Lehman Russ shell. His ruined body, strengthened with crude but terrifying cybernetics, making him tougher, faster, and even more unstoppable than before. Whatever Grotznik did, he didn't just bring Ghazghkull back, he made him stronger. And here's where the theories start flying. Because Orcs shouldn't survive what Ghazghkull went through. Even by their ridiculous standards, this was pushing it. Some fans believe that whatever Grotznik did was just incredibly, unbelievably lucky, that he happened to slap together the right parts in just the right way to keep Ghazghkull alive. But others think something much bigger was at play. There's a theory that Ghazghkull's own willpower kept him alive, that his connection to the Waaagh, his sheer refusal to die, allowed him to hold on long enough for Grotznik to rebuild him. Some even suggest that the Orc gods themselves had a hand in this, making sure their chosen warboss didn't go down before his Waaagh had even begun. After all, Orcs believe in their gods, and their gods are real, in some form or another. Could it be that Gork and Mork guided Grotznik's hands, making sure he did everything just right? Of course, there's a more cynical take, too. Some argue that Ghazghkull's survival was purely mechanical, that Grotsnik simply turned him into a walking tank, replacing whatever was too damaged with crude but effective orc engineering. If that's the case, then his immortality isn't supernatural at all. It's just brutal efficiency. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Ghazghkull returned. And when he stood back up, roaring louder than ever, stronger than ever, more terrifying than ever, the orcs listened. They saw what had happened. They saw their warboss refuse to die, and they believed. And when orcs believe, the universe bends to make it true. This was the moment that cemented Ghazghkull's legend. He wasn't just a warboss anymore. He was a prophet, a chosen leader, a walking embodiment of the Waaagh itself. And if he could survive this, what could possibly stop him? The answer, as it turns out, was nothing, because Ghazghkull wasn't just back. He was ready for war. When Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka walked out of Mad Doki Grotsnik's operating room, if you can even call it that, he wasn't just the same warboss who had fallen on Urk Prime. He was something else entirely. Bigger, meaner, and with a head quite literally reinforced with metal, he had been remade into a force of destruction unlike anything the Imperium had faced before. And what does an orc warboss do after surviving what should have been certain death? He gathers his boys and he goes to war. By this point, Ghazghkull's reputation wasn't just strong, it was unstoppable. Orcs don't need complex politics or bureaucracy to choose their leaders. They follow the biggest, strongest, and most Waaagh-infused warboss they can find. And when a warboss refuses to die, comes back with a head full of visions from Gork and Mork, and starts roaring about the biggest Waaagh the galaxy has ever seen, orcs listen. And so, the legend of Ghazghkull, Mag Uruk Thraka, exploded. He wasn't just another upstart warlord anymore. He was the prophet of the Waaagh, a walking force of nature, a storm of green that was about to be unleashed. And if there was one place in the galaxy that deserved his wrath, it was Armageddon. Now, let's talk about why Armageddon was such a big deal. Orcs love war, but Ghazghkull wasn't just looking for a scrap. He was looking for the war, the kind that could shake the entire Imperium to its core. And Armageddon? That was the perfect battleground. It wasn't just some random hive world. It was a fortress of industry, a world that the Imperium couldn't afford to lose. The factories of Armageddon pumped out tanks, weapons, and supplies for the Imperium's war machine, and to Ghazghkull, that meant only one thing. It was worth fighting for. And fight he did. The Waaagh. Ghazghkull unleashed on Armageddon was colossal. This wasn't just some raid. This was an invasion, an orc apocalypse. Hundreds of orc warbands, thousands of warships, and millions upon millions of orcs poured onto the planet like a green tidal wave. It was bigger than anything the Imperium had ever seen, and for the first time in a long time, humanity wasn't just fighting orcs. They were drowning in them. But here's what makes this war different from other orc invasions. Most orcs love a good scrap, but their attacks are usually chaotic, disorganized, and short-lived. Not this one. This was a Waaagh. That had strategy. This was a Waaagh. That wasn't just about smashing things, it was about winning. And that was terrifying. Because here's the thing about Ghazghkull. He isn't just strong. He isn't just big. He's smart. For an orc, that's rare. He knows how to command, how to keep orcs united, and how to wage war in a way that makes even the greatest human tacticians nervous. And on Armageddon, he showed the galaxy exactly why he was different. He coordinated attacks, he broke Imperial defenses, and he forced the Imperium into a desperate fight for survival. This wasn't just a battle, it was a massacre. And for a time, it looked like the orcs might actually win. But as we all know, the Imperium is too stubborn to die easily. Reinforcements came, Imperial commanders adapted, and after years of bloodshed, the war ground to a brutal stalemate. Ghazghkull wasn't defeated, but he wasn't victorious either, and for an orc, that's frustrating. Waaagh is about momentum, about unstoppable violence, and when a war slows down, well, Orcs start to get bored. So Ghazghkull did the one thing no one expected. He left. He didn't retreat. He didn't surrender. He simply decided that the fight wasn't big enough anymore. And just like that, he vanished into the void, leaving Armageddon a smoking ruin, with billions dead and the Imperium barely clinging to control. And this is where the real mystery begins. Because when Ghazghkull left, he wasn't running. He was gathering. He had seen the scale of the war on Armageddon, and it had only convinced him of one thing: his Waaagh wasn't big enough yet. So he set out to fix that. This was the moment when Ghazghkull stopped being just a war boss and became a force of destiny. He didn't just want war. He wanted the biggest war the galaxy had ever seen. And to make that happen, he needed more than just an army. He needed a crusade. Where he was going, what he was planning, and how he intended to return was a mystery. But one thing was certain: he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And that's what makes him so terrifying. He doesn't die, he doesn't stop, and he doesn't lose. He just gets bigger, stronger, and angrier. So the question remains: was this simply a tactical decision? Or was there something deeper driving him? Because if Ghazghkull truly is immortal, then this was never just about Armageddon. It was about something much, much bigger. And the next time he returned, it would shake the galaxy even harder than before. For most beings in the galaxy, losing your head is the end. No second chances, no miraculous recoveries, just death. But as we've already seen, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka doesn't follow the rules. He doesn't stay dead. He doesn't disappear into history like some forgotten warlord. He keeps coming back. And yet, there was a moment when it truly seemed like his story had finally reached its brutal conclusion. A moment when, by all logic, he should have been nothing more than a corpse rotting on the battlefield. That moment came at the hands of Ragnar Blackmane, the legendary wolf lord of the Space Wolves. Now, if you know anything about the Space Wolves, you know they aren't just warriors, they're hunters. They don't just fight, they chase, they stalk, and they kill with a primal fury that few in the Imperium can match. And if there was one orc in the galaxy who deserved to be hunted down, it was Ghazghkull. He had left Armageddon in ruins. His Waaagh had reshaped entire sectors, and despite all the Imperium's best efforts, he just wouldn't die. The wolves weren't going to let that stand. The battle that followed was something straight out of legend. Ghazghkull, the prophet of the Waaagh, standing against one of the greatest warriors the Imperium had ever produced. This wasn't just a fight. It was a clash of titans, the kind of brutal, world-shaking duel that could only happen in Warhammer 40k. And for all of Ghazghkull's strength, all of his size, cunning, and sheer brute force, this was a battle he was destined to lose. Ragnar cut through him, blow after blow, carving through the monstrous Warboss like a wolf, tearing apart its prey. Orcs are tough, incredibly tough, but Space Marines are built to kill the unkillable. And Ragnar? He wasn't just any Space Marine. He was one of the Imperium's best, fueled by the ferocity of Fenris, guided by the wrath of the Allfather himself. It was the ultimate test of strength, and when it was over, Ghazghkull was on his knees. And then, with a single final strike, Ragnar took his head. That should have been it. That should have been the end. Even orcs can't survive being beheaded. They might regenerate. They might endure wounds that would turn a human to dust. But once the head is gone, that's it. No more Waaagh, no more warlord, no more prophecy. It was the kind of brutal, decisive kill that the Imperium had been dreaming of for decades. Ghazghkull was dead. Or at least, he should have been. Here's where the whole story takes a turn from incredible to downright bizarre. Because instead of leaving his corpse on the battlefield as a warning to the orcs, instead of burning it to ash and scattering it across the stars, something strange happened. His severed head didn't stay lost. It didn't fade into obscurity. It was found, and not by just anyone, by Mad Doc Grotznik. Now, let's take a step back for a second. The odds of anyone recovering Ghazghkull's head in the chaos of battle with space marines and orcs tearing each other apart are insanely low. But somehow Grotznik got his hands on it. And if you think for even a second that this was just a coincidence, then you don't understand orcs. Because in the world of Warhammer 40K, coincidences don't happen, not like this. Some fans believe that this was just sheer dumb luck, that Grotznik was simply in the right place at the right time. But others think this was something more. Because remember, Ghazghkull wasn't just an orc war boss. He was a prophet, a figure so larger than life that his sheer existence bent reality around him. Orcs believe in the power of the Waaagh with such intensity that it changes the laws of physics. If enough of them believe that Ghazghkull couldn't die, that he wouldn't die, then maybe he didn't. Maybe in some twisted, reality-defying way, the Waaagh itself ensured that Grotznik found that head. And that raises an even bigger question. Was Ghazghkull ever truly dead at all? This is where things get really weird. Some orcs and some fans believe that as long as the Waaagh exists, Ghazghkull can't truly die. That his legend is so powerful, his presence so ingrained in orc kind, that his body is just a vessel, and vessels can be replaced. If that's true, then his head wasn't just a piece of meat. It was a relic, a thing infused with the raw, untamed power of the Waaagh itself. But if you prefer a more grounded explanation, then maybe the answer is simpler. Orcs are just ridiculously durable, and Grotznik is an absolute lunatic who can perform miracles with a chainsaw and some spare parts. Either way, the fact remains, Ghazghkull's body was destroyed, his head was taken, and yet, somehow, his story wasn't over. Because what happened next wasn't just a resurrection. It was a rebirth. And if you thought he was dangerous before, well, you have no idea what was coming. If Ghazghkull Meg Uruk Thraka had been any other orc, his story would have ended the moment Ragnar Blackmane's blade took his head clean off. That should have been the final. Chapter: One last brutal clash, an honorable end for a warlord who had shaken the galaxy. But we already know Ghazghkull doesn't die like everyone else. Somehow, his severed head, the most important piece of his existence, found its way back into the hands of Mad Doc Grotznik. And that's where things get really strange. Because, let's be honest, the chances of that happening by accident are so unbelievably low that it's almost laughable. The battlefield was a war zone. Ragnar had cut through Ghazghkull with the full force of Fenrisian fury, and the Imperium should have made absolutely sure that his remains were disposed of. And yet, against all logic, his head survived. Now let's stop for a second and ask the obvious question. How? Some fans argue that this was just pure orky luck, the same kind of reality-warping nonsense that lets orc weapons fire when they shouldn't and keeps their ramshackle spacecraft somehow functioning. Maybe Grotznik was just in the right place at the right time, sifting through the carnage and happened to stumble upon the single most important object in the Orc Empire. But come on, does that really sound like a coincidence? Others believe something much deeper was at play. See, orcs don't think about fate or destiny the way humans do. They don't have prophecies or grand plans. But what they do have is belief. And belief, when it comes to orcs, is power. If an entire Waaagh believed Ghazghkull wasn't truly dead, if they refused to accept that their warlord had been taken from them, then maybe the universe listened. Maybe reality itself bent just enough to make sure his head got where it needed to be. And if that's true, if the Waaagh itself played a role in ensuring his survival, then what does that mean for the question of his immortality? Because this is the second time Ghazghkull has defied death. The first was when he was shot in the head and received his visions. That could be written off as sheer resilience, maybe even just a survival. But this was different. This was his entire body being destroyed, his very existence seemingly erased from the battlefield, and yet somehow his most crucial piece, the one part that could bring him back, was saved. And that brings us to Mad Doc Grotznik. Grotznik wasn't just some random medic. He was the Mad Doc, a legend in his own right, a lunatic surgeon who could turn a pile of bloody scraps into a fully functioning orc again. And more importantly, he had an obsession with Ghazghkull. Ever since the first time he brought the Warboss back from the brink of death, Grotznik had been completely devoted to him, convinced that Ghazghkull was the greatest thing to ever happen to orc kind. Some even say he saw Ghazghkull as a divine figure, something more than just a warboss, a living embodiment of the Waaagh itself. So when he got his hands on Ghazghkull's head, there was no hesitation, no doubt, no questions. To Grotznik, there was never a possibility that Ghazghkull was truly dead. His body was gone. So what? Orcs are tough, and Grotznik was tougher. He had brought him back before, and he would do it again. And here's the terrifying part. He succeeded. What that means depends on who you ask. If you believe in the mechanical explanation, then it was just a matter of Grotznik's skills, his brutal but effective surgical methods, and a whole lot of crude orc cybernetics. He simply stitched the Warboss back together, bolted on whatever was missing, and through sheer insane determination, forced life back into his body. But if you believe in the Waaagh theory, then this was something far greater. Then Ghazghkull's survival wasn't just about his body. It was about his presence, his legend, his sheer refusal to stop existing. If that's true, then Ghazghkull isn't just an orc anymore. He's something else. Think about it. Every other warboss who has ever existed has eventually fallen. They rise, they fight, they die, and someone else takes their place. But Ghazghkull? He doesn't stay down. And if his survival is tied to the Waaagh itself, if the very fabric of orcish reality demands that he exist, then there's only one real conclusion to draw. He can't die. Not in the way normal beings do. Not in the way history says he should. As long as the orcs believe in him, as long as the Waaagh rages, he will always come back. Maybe in a different form, maybe rebuilt from nothing but scrap and fury, but he will return. And that's what makes Ghazghkull truly terrifying, because he's not just a warlord. He's not just another greenskin on a rampage. He might just be the first truly immortal orc. And if that's the case, then the galaxy has a very, very big problem. If you want to understand why Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka just won't die, you have to understand orcs. And if you want to understand orcs, you have to understand the Waaagh, that raw, chaotic, unexplainable force that drives everything they do. The Waaagh isn't just some war cry. It's not just a battle strategy. It's power. And not just metaphorical power either. It's real. Orcs don't work like the rest of the galaxy. They don't follow logic, they don't obey physics, and they sure as hell don't care what's supposed to be possible or impossible. Because when enough orcs believe something, it happens. This isn't a theory. This isn't speculation. It's been proven time and time again. Imperial scientists have studied orcs for centuries, trying to figure out how the hell their technology works when it really, really shouldn't. Their weapons? Barely functional pieces of scrap. Their vehicles? Junk slapped together with no real engineering behind it. And yet somehow, their guns fire, their engines roar to life, and their machines defy every known law of mechanics. Why? Because they believe they do. And if the belief of a few orcs can make a gun work when it has no right to, then what happens when millions of orcs believe in the same thing? That's where Ghazghkull's supposed immortality comes into question. Because if there's one thing every orc in the galaxy can agree on, it's this. Ghazghkull is the biggest, meanest, most unstoppable warboss to ever live. And if orcs believe something hard enough, then maybe, just maybe, the universe bends to make it true. This idea that the Waaagh isn't just a psychic field but an actual reality warping force has been debated among fans for years. Some believe it's just a minor effect, enough to boost their tech and give them an edge in battle. Others think it's something far, far greater, a force that could, under the right conditions, alter the fabric of reality itself. And if that's true, then Ghazghkull might be more than just a war boss. He might be a living embodiment of the Waaagh, a figure so deeply entrenched in Orc belief that the universe literally refuses to let him die. Think about it. Every time he's been killed, something has ensured his return. First, he was shot in the head and should have died, but instead, he got visions from Gork and Mork and became even stronger. Then he was cut down in battle, left for dead, only for his body to end up in the hands of the one orc crazy enough to bring him back. And finally, his head was completely severed from his body, an absolute death sentence for any living creature, and yet, through some impossible stroke of fate, it found its way back to Mad Doc Grotznik, the only being who could resurrect him. At what point do we stop calling this luck and start calling it something else? The Waaagh isn't just some passive force that orcs tap into. It's alive. It shapes the world around them, makes their reality work in ways that defy reason. And if enough orcs believe that Ghazghkull cannot die, then maybe, in a very real sense, he can't. This raises a terrifying possibility. What if Ghazghkull has already ascended beyond being just an orc? What if he is something more? Something that exists outside the normal rules of life and death? If orcs believe in their gods enough, those gods exist in some form. If they believe their warboss is unkillable, then perhaps he is. And this is where things get really wild. Some fans have theorized that if Ghazghkull continues to grow in power, continues to survive against impossible odds, he might become something greater than just a warlord. He might be on the path to godhood. Not in the way chaos does it, not as a demon or an immortal soul in the warp, but as a pure manifestation of the Waaagh itself. If that's true, then the Imperium isn't just dealing with a war boss anymore. They're dealing with something far worse. Something that can't be stopped, can't be killed, and will never ever stop fighting. And that begs the final chilling question. If Ghazghkull is truly immortal, if he can't die as long as orcs believe in him, then what happens when the entire orc race unites under his banner? Because if he is a product of their belief, then as long as orcs exist, so will Ghazghkull, and that means the war will never end. There's a saying among the Imperium's more rational minds, never attribute to magic what can be explained by science, and while that might hold up in some corners of the galaxy, when it comes to orcs, the line between the two is paper thin. We've already talked about the Waaagh, and the idea that belief might literally be keeping Ghazghkull alive, but there's another possibility. What if his survival isn't supernatural at all? What if it's just a matter of pure, brutal orky engineering? Let's take a step back and look at what we actually know. Ghazghkull has died multiple times, shot in the head, torn apart on the battlefield, beheaded by Ragnar Blackmane, and yet, somehow, he keeps coming back. But every single time he returns, he isn't just alive, he's stronger than before, bigger, tougher, more unstoppable. That doesn't exactly scream divine intervention. That sounds a lot more like someone's been rebuilding him. And that's where the orcish obsession with mech boys and mad docs comes into play. Orc medicine is a horrifying thing. It shouldn't work. By all logic, it should be a complete disaster. These aren't trained doctors with medical degrees. These are lunatics with chainsaws and welding torches who fix injuries by shoving bits of scrap metal into their patients and hoping for the best. And yet, it works. Orcs survive wounds that should be fatal. They lose limbs and just get new ones slapped on. They get torn in half and somehow keep fighting. And Mad Doc Grotznik? He isn't just any orc surgeon. He is the Mad Doke, the best or worst, depending on how you look at it, of his kind. If there's anyone in the galaxy who could take a decapitated head, slap it onto a new body, and have it actually function, it's him. And that raises a question. Is Ghazghkull really immortal, or is Grotznik just that damn good? Because, let's be real, orcs don't fear death the way other species do. They don't sit around worrying about mortality, and they definitely don't have existential crises about their place in the universe. But they do love fixing things. And Ghazghkull? He's the biggest, best thing Grotznik has ever worked on. Imagine you're a mad scientist, and you've got a project you've been obsessed with for years. You've already brought it back once, made it bigger, better, more powerful. Then, one day, it gets destroyed again. What do? You rebuild it, you make it even stronger, you push the limits of what's possible, and that's exactly what Grotznik did. There's a very real argument that Ghazghkull isn't the same orc he started as. His original body was completely wrecked. His head, the only remaining piece of him, was grafted onto something else. And that leads to another disturbing thought. How much of Ghazghkull is still Ghazghkull? If every time he gets killed, he's rebuilt from scratch, if he's constantly getting new parts, new enhancements, new cybernetics, then at what point does he stop being the same? Being he was before? Is he still the original Warboss? Or is he something else now? A construct of orc technology, pieced together over and over again like a machine? It wouldn't be the first time something like this happened. The Imperium does it all the time with their servitors, lobotomized machines built from the remains of fallen warriors. The Adeptus Mechanicus replaces so many of their own body parts with metal that some of them are more machine than flesh. Even the Necrons, arguably the most extreme example, transferred their consciousness into immortal bodies of living metal, making themselves effectively indestructible. Could Ghazghkull be heading down a similar path? Could he be turning into something beyond a mere orc, a hybrid of flesh and machine, endlessly rebuilt, endlessly upgraded, forever marching toward bigger and bigger wars? Some fans believe that this is exactly what's happening. That Ghazghkull is slowly evolving, his physical form becoming less important than the idea of him. That as long as his head, or even just the knowledge of him exists, he can always be rebuilt, reforged, brought back stronger. And this ties directly into his supposed immortality. Maybe it isn't that he can't die, it's just that every time he does, orc technology brings him back. Maybe there's nothing supernatural about it at all. Maybe it's just crude but effective biomechanics, the same kind of engineering that lets orc war engines function when they're barely held together with spit and hope. But then again, if that's true, why hasn't it worked for other war bosses? Why aren't there dozens of Ghazghkull-level warlords being resurrected after every battle? Maybe it's not just the technology. Maybe it's something more. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's the perfect storm of belief, fate, and brutal, barely understood science. Either way, one thing is certain. Ghazghkull shouldn't be alive. And yet, he is. And the next time he falls, the next time the galaxy thinks it's finally rid of him, there's every reason to believe that he'll just come back, bigger, stronger, and even more terrifying than before. And if that's true, then the Imperium isn't just fighting a war boss. They're fighting something that can never be truly defeated. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka isn't the first being in the Warhammer 40k universe to cheat death. He's not the only one to be torn apart, left for dead, or even outright annihilated, only to come back stronger. The grim darkness of the far future is filled with characters who just won't stay dead. But the real question is, does Ghazghkull belong in the same league as the true immortals of the setting? Or is there something different about him? Let's start with the most obvious comparison, the Primarchs. They're the closest thing to demigods the Imperium has, and many of them have defied death in ways that make even Ghazghkull's survival look almost reasonable. Take Roboute Guilliman, for example. The guy was literally slashed open by a demon. Blade left in a near-death state for 10,000 years, and then brought back by a mix of eldritch technology and the Emperor's will. That's a whole different level of survival compared to an orc warlord getting patched up by a lunatic with a chainsaw. Then there's Mortarion, who died in his duel against Guilliman, only to be dragged back into the warp and reformed by Nurgle into something even worse. Or Magnus the Red, who was shattered during the Horus Heresy but remade through the sheer power of the warp. Even Angron, after being vaporized on Armageddon, didn't really die. He just dissolved into the warp, waiting for his next chance to return. The key difference here? These guys aren't really alive anymore. They're warp-touched, god-bound, or infused with something that makes them more than just flesh and blood. Their resurrections aren't just a matter of medicine or technology. It's sorcery, divine intervention, or outright warp-fueled madness. And that's where Ghazghkull stands, apart. There's no chaos god watching over him, no warp entity keeping him alive. He isn't being resurrected through dark rituals or ancient superweapons. His survival, while almost unbelievable, is still grounded in orc biology, sheer resilience, and possibly the insane power of the Waaagh. But let's not stop there. There are plenty of other near-immortal figures in the galaxy, and some of them might actually be a closer match. Take Saint Celestine, for example. She's a warrior saint of the Imperium who has been killed more times than anyone can count, only to rise again through sheer divine will. Every time she falls, the Emperor chooses her to return, sending her back into the fray as an instrument of his wrath. There's something eerily similar between her resurrection and Ghazghkull's, especially if you buy into the idea that the orc's belief keeps him alive. Both of them have followers who refuse to believe in their death, and in the 40K universe, belief is power. The difference? Celestine is explicitly tied to the Emperor's will, while Ghazghkull's existence is driven by the collective madness of the Waaagh. And then, of course, we have the Necrons. These guys don't even die in the conventional sense. Their bodies are made of living metal, and even if you destroy them, their consciousness is uploaded and placed into a new form. Some of their most powerful leaders, like Imhotep the Stormlord, have survived countless wars, being blasted apart only to wake up somewhere else, good as new. But the difference here is that Necrons are mechanical immortals. They aren't bending reality to stay alive. They have the technology to make it happen. And that's where we hit the core of Ghazghkull's mystery. He isn't a Primarch infused with warp energy. He isn't a saint chosen by the Emperor. He isn't a Necron with the ability to just download himself into a new body. His survival is something else entirely, something uniquely orcish. Some fans believe that this actually makes him even more terrifying than the other so-called immortals of 40K, because Ghazghkull isn't relying on some divine force or high-tech resurrection protocols. His survival is based on something more unpredictable, something wilder. If Celestine dies, the Emperor brings her back. But what happens if the Emperor finally fades? If Necrons are destroyed, they can be permanently erased if their tomb worlds are wiped out. Even the Primarchs, powerful as they are, still need the warp, dark magic, or advanced tech to keep them going. But Ghazghkull, his immortality isn't tied to anything other than the belief of his people, and that belief is limitless. As long as orcs exist, as long as they still chant his name, still see him as their greatest warlord, he will never truly be gone. So, does Ghazghkull belong in the same category as Guilliman, Celestine, or the Necrons? Maybe. But in some ways, his survival is even scarier, because he doesn't follow any of their rules. He isn't bound to a god. He doesn't need a warp entity to save him. He doesn't rely on lost ancient technology. He is a living, breathing force of destruction, a warlord who keeps returning not because of some divine plan or high-tech resurrection chamber, but because orcs refuse to let him die. And that makes him one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. Because while the Necrons have their limits, while chaos is bound to the warp, while even the Emperor himself is slowly fading, the Waaagh will never stop. And that means neither will Ghazghkull. So, after everything we've gone through, The battles, the deaths, the comebacks, the impossible survivals. It all comes down to one simple question. Is Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka truly immortal? Is he just unbelievably lucky, saved by circumstance and the questionable genius of Mad Doc Grotznik? Or is there something deeper, something fundamentally unstoppable about him? On the surface, you could argue that Ghazghkull's return from death is just a mix of brute, resilience, and crude orky technology. He's an orc after all, and orcs are absurdly tough. Their biology is engineered for war, their bodies recover from wounds that would kill almost anything else, and their sheer stubbornness means they often refuse to die when they should. Add to that the fact that orc medicine is basically just violent guesswork that somehow works, and it's easy to say that Ghazghkull isn't immortal. He's just a really, really hard bastard to kill. But then you have to look at the bigger picture, because it's not just that he survived, it's how he survived. Shot in the head, he gets a vision from Gork and Mork and comes back stronger. Left for dead on Urk Prime. Somehow his body disappears, and he returns even more powerful. Decapitated by one of the greatest space wolves in history. His head magically finds its way to the only orc who can bring him back. At some point, this stops looking like luck, and that's where the real horror sets in. Because if Ghazghkull isn't just lucky, if he isn't just tough, then what does that mean? It means the Waaagh itself is keeping him alive. That's what makes him truly terrifying. Unlike the Primarchs, he isn't tied to the warp. Unlike Celestine, he isn't bound to a god. Unlike the Necrons, he isn't being uploaded into some ancient databank every time he dies. Ghazghkull is being brought back purely because the orcs refuse to believe he can die. And in Warhammer 40k, belief is power. Orcs are unique in that they shape reality through sheer collective willpower. Their weapons shouldn't work, but they do. Their ships shouldn't fly, but they do. Their entire existence is fueled by belief overriding logic. So if millions, maybe billions of orcs believe that Ghazghkull cannot die, then maybe he can't. This isn't just speculation either. We've seen the Waaagh affect reality before. We've seen orc mechs keep running with zero fuel because the crew believes they should. We've seen orc weapons fire despite being literal chunks of metal with no working parts. If all of orc kind sees Ghazghkull as an unstoppable, unkillable warlord, then what's stopping reality from bending to make it true? And if that's the case, then Ghazghkull isn't just an orc warboss. He's a concept. The Imperium, Chaos, even the Necrons, all of them rely on specific things to survive. Guilliman needs the Emperor's will, Chaos needs the warp, the Necrons need their resurrection protocols. But Ghazghkull? He only needs one thing. Orcs. As long as orcs exist, as long as they keep fighting, keep growing, keep believing in the Waaagh, Ghazghkull will always return. Maybe not in the same body, maybe not in the same form, but he will never truly be gone. And that's what makes him far scarier than any immortal being in the galaxy. Because even if the Imperium manages to kill him again, even if the next Ragnar Blackmane or the next Primarch cuts him down, it won't matter. Somewhere, somehow, the orcs will bring him back. Because to them, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka is Waaagh incarnate. And as long as Waaagh exists, so will he. So, is he immortal? In the traditional sense, maybe not. He can be hurt, he can be killed, he can be destroyed. But does that mean he's gone forever? Absolutely not. Because Ghazghkull doesn't just survive. He returns. And when he does, the galaxy will burn. And that's the true nightmare of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. He's not a god, but he doesn't need to be. He's not a demon, but he's just as unrelenting. He's not a Primarch, but he doesn't need ancient genetics or warp magic to keep him going. He is something far, far worse. He is the war that never ends. And if history has taught us anything, it's that no matter how many times the Imperium thinks it has won, he always comes back. So after everything we've discussed, after all the battles, the impossible survivals, the Waaagh-fueled miracles, there's really only one thing left to say. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka isn't just a war boss. He's something much bigger. The galaxy is full of terrifying figures. Demon Primarchs, Necron Overlords, Chaos Champions, beings that have walked through death and emerged stronger. But Ghazghkull? He isn't part of some ancient prophecy. He isn't a puppet of the warp. He isn't driven by dark gods or eldritch technology. He is the living will of the orcs, a warlord who embodies everything that makes them unstoppable. And that's why the Imperium fears him. Because every time they think they've finally won, every time they believe they've rid the galaxy of him, he returns. That's the true nightmare. Not just that he's powerful, not just that he's cunning, but that he's inevitable. The Imperium can kill a war boss. They can wipe out a warband. They can even shatter a Waaagh if they throw enough resources at it. But they cannot kill an idea. And that's what Ghazghkull has become. He is not bound by the same rules as humans, Eldari, or even chaos itself. He is held together by belief, and belief is the strongest force in the orcish mind. That's why Mad Doc Grotznik found his head. That's why his body was reforged. That's why, no matter how many times he falls, he always comes back stronger. And the most terrifying part? He's not done. Because Ghazghkull doesn't just want war. He doesn't just want conquest. He wants the biggest Waaagh the galaxy has ever seen. Armageddon was just the beginning. Every time he returns, his Waaagh grows. Every time he falls, he rises again, with even more orcs at his back. It's not a question of if he'll return. It's a question of when, and the Imperium knows it. Right now, somewhere in the vastness of space, he's out there, gathering, growing, preparing. His Waaagh is building, his warbands are uniting, and when he finally unleashes the next great war, the galaxy will never be the same. So what do you think? Is Ghazghkull truly immortal? Is he just the result of orky toughness and some really questionable medicine, or is there something deeper, keeping him alive? Something that makes him more than just another war boss? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40K's greatest figures, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another video.